Welcome to Roots of Equity, a podcast dedicated to sharing our local perspectives and lived experiences around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Caribbean. In this podcast, we seek to birth our own vocabulary around inclusion, in our language and in our own words. I'm your host, James Walker, and in this episode, we speak to Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, a true feminist powerhouse. Our conversation journeys from the state of women in the workplace to the care economy and beyond. So welcome. We're very excited to have with us today Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. Dr. Hosein, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Hosein. I'm Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies and the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, we'd love to dive into the topic around gender and around gender equity, in the Caribbean, in our region, in Trinidad, where we're recording this. So I just want to ask a basic question about women in the workplace. And some may look at me and say, well, we have girls tend to do so well in education now, and they're populated our tertiary education institutions, and they're really dominating the exams. And look how we just replaced one female president in Trinidad with another female president. Everything seems fine to me. Well, how do we, what is your perspective on that? What's your perspective on the state of play of women in the workplace in our region? How do we set some foundation for what's the current situation?
I think that's a really great question. And the thing about understanding women in the workplace, in the labor market, is that it can be both complex and contradictory. And so that's why we often have disagreements or debates. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there could be contradictory realities for women and men, first of all, which might stop us from fighting and maybe working through those contradictions. You started off with girls and doing well in education and women doing well in education. And it's true, in the last 30 years at the University of the West Indies, women have come to dominate university graduates, 60% to 40% men, 70% even in Jamaica. And so women have turned to education to enable them to bring greater power to their negotiation with the labor market and the way it is segregated vertically and horizontally. Now, what's interesting, which is called the Caribbean paradox, is that although women have done so well in education, including dominating in securing qualifications, they only remain 30% of parliament. They remain something like 4% of CEOs in the financial sector. They are in marginal numbers as leaders of business, and they still predominate in the lowest paid sectors of the economy, earning less than $3,000 a month. They predominate in the informal sector, and they continue to exercise or to be responsible for an unequal burden of care in the home. And we saw this during COVID, when we saw, in comparison to men, how many women had to leave their careers or their jobs in order to be at home with their children, and how many women's jobs and careers and even work advancement was affected. And so I think an important question for us to ask as people in the Caribbean is, what happens when women leave education with their overwhelming qualifications? What happens that leads to such lower numbers in politics, in business, in other sectors of leadership, whether those are, say, religion, and so on? And what happens that leads to them still having an unequal burden of care in the home, which we know affects their ability to labor in the waged economy? And that is the predominant Caribbean paradox related to women's labor today.
That's super interesting, and it reflects a lot on the work of the now new recipients of the 2023
which was so great.
Nobel Prize in Economics, Claudia Golden, Professor Golden from Harvard University. And part of the report that the Nobel Committee would have put together, it did mention something similar around, when looking for policy response, education alone is not enough. That there may be societal norms, or there may be infrastructures or structures in place that might still hold back a woman from eventually becoming a leader in whatever field that she chooses to pursue. So let's zoom in a little bit on our own region. And are there societal norms that you see, or maybe structural elements that we could, I guess, take these both in turn? They probably both need to be addressed.
Well, the first societal norm is the fact that women are considered to be responsible predominantly for the care of children. And that's been changing. It's been changing in the Caribbean over 20 or more years of feminist activism. I remember in the 1990s, UNIFEM had Share the Care campaigns to encourage men to play a greater role as nurturers, because of course both women and men are nurturers. Mm-hmm. They've just been defined very differently. So that continues to be the major ideological burden that women continue to negotiate. But the reason that they continue to negotiate is not just individual men in the household needing to play a greater role, but because the workplace is structured around the idea that there's somebody at home to take care of kids. So when school is done at 2:30, but work is done at 4 or 5, what's happening and who's organizing that? In a country where the care economy and the responsibility of those in the economy who also have a predominant burden for care, when that relationship between the care economy and wage economy is taken into account, we would do things very differently. We would have much more openness to work from home policies and flexible labor than we do. The pandemic moved us there in many ways. So even the public service now is considering work from home policies in a way they would not have before. We would have daycares, I would argue, on every corner, the way we have rum shops.
Right. Okay.
On every corner. So that daycare was accessible.
Ideally not in the same place.
Well, very often they're sharing the same location in the Caribbean, but we would have daycares on every corner, because then daycare facilities and support would be easily accessible. And it would start really with the change from paternity leave, frankly. So there was an idea from extended parental and paternity leave that sharing the care is an equal responsibility. It's not just children, it's also care of the aged and the elderly. So in the Caribbean, we have a high rate of non-communicable diseases, diabetes and heart problems and so on. And somebody needs to care for the aged and the ill. Someone needs to go with them to the clinic. Someone needs to go, to look after them at home. We don't have good elder services the way some other countries might. So somebody needs to take them back and forth to the doctor and so on. And that responsibility is often borne by women. So ideologically, the idea of care receiving so little awareness in our society in terms of the numbers of hours of labor that it requires, and ideologically in terms of us assuming that women will perform that work at their own expense, either financially or in terms of their mental health or in terms of anything else. Those are the major attitudinal shifts that need to happen.
And do you find that folks are now going to the extent to say that the care that one performs in the home, be that for a child, be that for an elder, should also be monetarily compensated either by the state or otherwise? How are those conversations progressing?
Well, these are really old conversations that have been happening since the 1970s. So the Wages for Housework campaign, which was started by Salma James, who was partner to the very famous Tunapuna man, CLR James, began that campaign. But sometimes people think it's a bit ridiculous because they don't understand its roots. Actually, the Wages for Housework campaign, but also the idea of valuing care work in the home, super, super important. Now, Trinidad and Tobago, which most people don't know, began to count housework in the Counting Unremunerated Work Act in 2000. So if anybody participated in the census in 2000, you would have been asked, how many hours do you spend mopping? How many hours do you spend sweeping? And so on. Super progressive, right? Because Trinidad had just made this decision in the census to count the work that goes on in the home. Now it's been calculated by complex calculations, but they have calculated that if you assign a monetary value to the hours that are spent doing work in the home, which of course you can do because you can pay somebody to do it,
Sure.
then it's bigger than the world's GDP because so many hours go into it.
Right.
So here's the goal. The goal is that the work that goes on in the home, whether by women or men or children or children taking care of other children, that work is first of all counted. How many hours does it take of people's lives, which tells us a lot about the rest of their lives, including their ability to earn an income. First of all, it should be seen, and we don't see it. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it should be counted. And thirdly, it should be assigned a value or a contribution in terms of GDP. Because right now, it's as if it doesn't exist, as if nobody's doing it, and as if it contributes nothing to value. Those hours literally don't exist. And yet they reproduce the working population every day to come out and work in the waged economy. So that's the goal. The goal is to value care work. And when you see how much value is produced, to understand that we need to think about our policies in the wage workforce in terms of supporting both what goes on in the home and what goes on in the workforce. Because of course, people are managing both in their daily lives. Anyone who's a parent, who has an elderly parent, will tell you that they're on their phone at some point checking on things, that they're organizing for somebody to pick up somebody, that they're making calls. So these are our real lives. Our real lives integrate work and family. And the old division of having men at work and women at home, and therefore men were not dealing with the family and women were not dealing with the waged economy, is just not a reality. And it doesn't lead to the kind of best experience for workers, and it doesn't lead to the best way for an economy to function.
And even the outcomes for the kids that need to be cared for, or the elderly person. So to think that you're not valuing and seeing the contribution that a woman has for their kids, whereby, if that woman is actually doing so much that's allowing those kids to flourish either in their schools or in their extracurriculars or whatever the case may be, not seeing it, not valuing it, actually undersells the role of a parent or undersells the role of a carer. It's more than just paying someone to watch my child. It's teaching my child to read or ride a bike. And there's plenty other value that may not be easily quantifiable by an economist, but even intangible values to the way families, come together and thrive, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely the point. And the thing is, we learned so much from the pandemic, right? So first of all, the government made a policy during the pandemic instantly overnight to close schools and send children home, on the assumption that somebody was home for 24 hours of the day to look after children, in a society where many homes are woman-headed, and in which there are not necessarily two parents, and in which there's not necessarily an easy division of somebody home as a mythical housewife and somebody as some mythical breadwinner. And yet government policy acts as if that myth is an actual reality. And so what happens isn't just about children missing out on their development. What happens when we have workplace policies and state policies that don't recognize the centrality of care to our entire society's functioning is that children become placed in danger. They become vulnerable to all kinds of abuse and neglect, and they have to function in situations in which they can become very vulnerable. And that's in fact a reality. So we know that during holiday periods, when parents don't necessarily have safe care for their children while they have to work, or where they may have to leave their children with others, we know that the rates of child sexual abuse in the society go up during those kinds of periods, because the reports then show up in times like October and in May, when students come back from holidays and are then disclosing. And these are major social issues. And the world is changing now. The world is changing and recognizing that, and including workplaces are changing and recognizing that we want integrated societies.
Fantastic segue into what organizations and companies can do or should do, and how they can look at it. I get the sense sometimes that managers or leaders may be hesitant to talk about your home life or to ask questions that may need to be asked for them to know what accommodations might need to be made. And, what could sit behind that hesitance to have the conversation around the more integrated realities that people live in, as opposed to just dealing with you at work. I just want to deal with you 9 to 5, but don't talk to me about what you need in your home life. What might be the barriers to having that kind of conversation?
Well, I think one thing that companies can do is, instead of approaching it in terms of individual people's lives, to approach it as policy approaches. So, for example, it's not so much about dealing with a case of sexual harassment. It's about having a preventative company policy that's familiar to all the workers, in which the norms of the place are laid out and the resources available to staff are laid out. And so companies can show leadership, not by necessarily having an individual worker come and say, listen, my mother-in-law lives with me. And also, I need to leave at 3:00 to pick up the kids, but I'll come in at 6 a.m. Or, a company needs to say, listen, this is our approach to work-family balance. This is our profile or our understanding of who our employees are and what they're navigating. This is our understanding, for example, that that there are high levels of mental anxiety and distress in workplaces because of this challenge sometimes. I know a lot of people in Trinidad, a lot of mothers, but perhaps not only mothers. I know a lot of mothers, though, who have to bring their kids to work after they pick them up from school. Mm-hmm. I know a mother that had her daughter basically sleep on a little blanket underneath her desk when she came from primary school until she was ready to leave. Mm-hmm. And we're all familiar with somebody who might have her kids and they're sitting by her desk because she needs to finish at 4:30, but she ran off and got them. So understanding what is the profile of your employee and what their needs might be, and therefore structuring company spaces, company policies around that is a more proactive way to do it. Because when people see companies, and we're seeing this all the time now, we're seeing people want companies that have great diversity policies. People want companies that have great sustainability approaches in their businesses. And when people see companies that have great work-family balance policies and approaches, those companies will attract people who would want to stay because their conditions there are really supportive and comfortable ones for them and their family. So I would suggest doing it that way. I'll give you a completely other example. In terms of domestic violence, so in the Caribbean, the rates of domestic violence are quite high, violence against women. 1 in 3 women report violence by a partner. And of course, the reports of non-partner sexual violence are quite high, right? Women go to work every day. So it means that women who are experiencing violence, who may not be reporting to police, who may not be reporting to service providers, are going to work every day. There's a ton of data on this. The data shows that women who experience violence experience higher mental distress at work, loss of confidence, unspecified body pains, and a huge drop in their productivity, right? So we can calculate the relationship between women's experiences of violence and the experiences they're then having in their workplace setting. So what should companies do? Companies shouldn't wait, for example, for a woman to come and say, listen, my partner is stalking me at the taxi stand, or things happened last night, I had to go make a report. Companies should start with a domestic violence policy that says, if you are experiencing this, you have access to employee assistance program, right? You can have access. We have a small fund set aside for if you can't travel home because you're being stalked at the taxi stand, which is very common. I know women that's been a reality for. That'll carry you home for this period. Maybe we have all our HR staff are trained in securing a protection order, right, so that they can help you they can help advise you about how you can go about getting this, and therefore you can feel more supported to be able to create the safety you need to be able to continue with your life.
So it's about being proactive, because the likelihood of the woman coming to their boss and having to admit that's also quite a big ask of that person, right?
This is it.
Being proactive in the policy helps in that regard.
Yeah, and there's so much companies can in fact do. So I think all HR people should be trained in what are the 10 steps when a woman is experiencing violence. You know, what can she do? What are the risks involved? What are her feelings at the time? And how can she best be supported and advised? I mean, that should just be training that happens across all companies, all HR people, for example, and things like that. So when, again, all the HR people can be trained in understanding the issues of work-life balance, whether experienced by women or by men, because we know somebody's looking after the children, the aged, and the ill. And in our society, we know there is not a lot of support for those types of care. In other countries, you might have buses that pick up disabled persons and give them autonomy and mobility, you know, that are wheelchair friendly buses. Or we will know that for elderly people, there are mobile clinics that are, those services are not available. And where public services are not available, the burden falls on individuals to do that. So these are the things that I think are changing. That is that companies are seeing workers less as just workers and are beginning to see them more as human beings. Yeah. Who want to work and live productive lives, but are managing their care responsibilities often as if they don't exist in relation to their work life.
You shared a bit of some of these statistics around the share of females in leadership positions, like in government and in CEOs of financial corporations and whatnot. So when speaking with leaders and managers about what they can do to be more proactive in organizations, you may find yourself often talking to men. And so I'm interested to hear, when you've had conversations with men or when addressing men, especially in Caribbean men or Trinidadian men, is there a language or are there ways of talking about the needs of women that speak to men more readily than others? Are there ways to approach the topic? I'm just thinking for someone who's out there in a company or an organization and they would like to have a courageous conversation with their boss or their peer. Maybe they heard something happening in a department. They want to talk to their departmental head who's their peer. How do they crack that conversation in a courageous way and one that you think would get across to men?
Well, I think you have to be strategic. That's the first thing, which is you always have to sell an idea to somebody on the basis of how they are going to benefit. Whether they're going to benefit by feeling like a good person, or whether they're going to benefit by thinking they're doing good in the world, or whether there's going to be personal credit or company credit. That's unfortunately how the world works. So, I mean, feminists have learned that, right? We've had to convince the world that gender justice is good for men, is good for the world, is good, when justice should just be an ideal that we all agree is necessary on its own. We shouldn't even have to calculate the monetary value of diversity.
Just be just.
Yeah, we should just be like, well, quite obviously diversity is necessary. And so I think if you want to do that, you need to know that there are push and pull factors around women in leadership. The push factors, for example, are the questions of how many women want to or are able to work the kinds of hours, put in that, or have the support, either domestic or familial support, to put in the kinds of hours that it requires to climb that ladder in those specific 30s and 40s years. Many, many women fall out because of childcare responsibilities. And that's just a fact.
Certainly.
So first, do women have the support? So those are some of the push factors. But the pull factors are very often around mentorship. Very, very often around mentorship. So if a company thinks, listen, we've only had a small percentage of CEOs. If you look at the University of the West Indies, as dominated as it is by women students, there've only been 4 or 5 guild presidents that were women in 75 years.
Really?
Right? So what explains that? So it's bizarre, right? Women dominated, university dominated by male leadership, even at the student level. But mentorship, and this is work I've tried to do with students over the years as well at various times. Mentorship is key. And that often happens with men. So what happens with men is older men will see young men and think, oh, I like him. He's got ideas.
It reminds me of me.
Yeah. And I see him. He's got the edge, right? He's got a killer instinct, and they boys club him, and you go out for a drink. Maybe you play golf. Golf is a real thing. And
got to learn that one.
and so you mentor through a lot of informal mentorship, right? And that's also a fact. Women are not involved in informal mentorship by men because there's a lot of tensions around women-men informal relations in our society. They can be quite delicate, but they don't happen the way they do with men because it's very boysy. So men will see other men, they'll be like, oh, do you want to go have a drink? And then they might give them some advice. They might do a boyish joke. And there's a ton of informal advice, liming, spaces for liming, and so on.
Just exposure, right? Just that the now understands that person a little bit more.
And even spaces. If you're a woman and you're a lawyer and you're in a firm with a lot of guy lawyers and it's now 7:00 and everybody's drinking and you're the only woman there, you're going to be like, well, I know we're all colleagues, but I don't know if I want to stay as they drink into 9:00. So I think I'm going to take a few drinks and then at 7, I'm going to head home and then those 4 guys will stay there and they could keep drinking till 9 or 10, 11 and there's no threat. There's no question of how will they see me. There's no question of how will I be seen drinking with them. Will they be talking about me the next day? Is this a matter of status or is this a matter of stigma? There's no issues around that. And so the mentorship often happens informally, which often means women are cut out of it for one reason or another. And so formal, explicit mentorship is absolutely essential, and anyone will tell you that. And so CEOs at the top, men CEOs, need to decide, listen, having this 5%, 10%, 15%, anything less than 50%, frankly, is not what we stand for, because quite clearly something is happening here that's causing an inequity. We can or can't put our fingers on it, but we know the outcome is inequitable. Right? Something unfair is going on because these are bright women and they work hard and we want them, but why are they not getting up to, and what do they need? What do they need to climb that ladder? And so mentorship means identifying them and starting to give them the informal advice, however it is they can best receive it at the times that they can best receive it. Maybe it's lunches instead of after work drinks, right? Because that can happen in the safety of a daytime encounter. And then formal mentorship, and then formal opportunities, and then tracking them through, saying, listen, where do you want to be in 5 years? Because I see you here, and let's work through what you need to get there. I mean, I've done that with students, where I've said, listen, in 5 years, you're going to be in the UN. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to send you to here. You're going to get experience in this. These are the themes you're going to become an expert on. And they have ended up in the UN because there've been explicit mentorship of them. And that's what women need. And that's what they need from men. And that's what would enable them to cross that ceiling.
It's not just about women seeking out female role models to mentor them, but the younger women in organizations or more junior women looking, even if it's a male mentor, you're taking the male mentorship. And I think mentorship is super important. I agree with that. And sponsorship as well, because it's the conversation about who gets the promotion that matters. It's not just, hey, I'm giving you some feedback so you can improve yourself, but I'm also putting your name on the table when the time comes and vouching for you in that circumstance and scenario and pushing you too. So I think that's huge. Mentorship and sponsorship is huge.
I mean, I have to say, as women, we're so used to doing 10 times more just to prove that we are, can compete, that sometimes we're still trying to get to the point where we would be considered, qualified, and we discount the fact that we're already there. For example, I was offered a position, in something, and I said, I have no experience doing this at all. And, I'm turning down leadership in this position. I'll accept a less leadership position because I feel I need to learn first because I've never done this. They asked me twice. And I said both times, I just don't have the experience. And also it was during the pandemic.
Right.
And my child was home with me full time because schools were closed. So I said, okay. The person who took the leadership position, who was a man, had no experience whatsoever, but accepted the position. And it's when I then sat in those meetings, I realized, in fact, I had run an organization, which is the Institute for Gender Studies, for 5 years. I knew about strategic planning. I knew about contracts. I knew about team building. I knew about human resource management. I knew about fundraising. I knew about public relations. I knew about media. And I had just completely
undersold yourself.
It took me to get there, see somebody who did not have those qualifications function, who did in fact accept the leadership, to go, what was I doing?
Right.
In fact, I could have done this with my eyes closed. Mm-hmm. And so combination of thinking, listen, I need to be available for my daughter to make sure that I perform my unequal burden of care, and combination of discounting my qualifications. And I was so shocked because I'm a super unbelievably empowered feminist. Right. And yet here I was in the same position of so many women. It was a real wake-up call. And so those are the push examples, right, along with the pull factors as well.
Because there are lots of studies which talk about how women, undersell themselves in interviews and in recruitment in particular, and not even putting themselves up for a job even to be considered or interviewed because they feel, well, I'm not there. I also reflect on some advice that a woman gave me. She was the head of environmental at BP and in the UK, and she told me, James, well, when you go for your next set of jobs, you need to only be halfway there. Halfway, you be able to deliver half of it okay, so that you don't have to, be kicked out. But you need at least half of it that you don't know what to do and you can't do it yet because you have to learn. Otherwise, you're jumping into a job where you know everything, you're not going to learn anything, and you're too young to not learn anything. And that was very powerful advice that I kept in every job change that I've made since then, to not feel that you need the 100%. But it's definitely something that I'm aware of, that studies have shown that women are far less likely to overshoot in an interview, and men are a bit more likely to BS, I guess. So yeah, super interesting.
But also men are given credit for being authority figures that women are not. I mean, I'm put on television all the time as a gender expert who's been doing this for, 20 or more years. And next to me, media will have a male perspective with no training in the field whatsoever.
Right.
And I'm not a female perspective there. I'm an expert. I'm a technical expert in the field, put next to somebody with no expertise in the field, who is just a man. And that's his qualification. and this happens repeatedly. And I'm saying this because it's a silly example, but it's a norm that even when women are super experts in a field, you still have to prove that you are your legitimate authority in comparison to people who may have, or men who may have none of those qualifications, but who are taken as authority figures simply because this is their opinion. And so that translates right throughout the society into why women feel they need to be so qualified to be considered, because that's the reality.
And I want to share a little bit of an experience that I had recently in a company that was a new company. And in this new company, they needed to recruit, let's say, 300 roles, and they had to do it quickly. And they did it via panels, interview panels. because it was a new company, there was no boys club legacy to draw from. There were a few people in the company and some of them were doing the interviews, but there was always an outside person to the company in the panel. And there was always someone on that panel who was from HR, and HR was all women at the time. So almost every interview for that company featured the hiring manager, a subject matter expert that was external to the company, and at least one female, definitely, because the HR person was female, but often the hiring manager or the subject matter expert might have been female as well.
A woman, yeah.
The result in that company is that today, 50% of the leadership and management of that energy sector company are women, and roughly 50% of the wider organization as well are women. It's almost unheard of in energy, oil and gas companies globally that you'd have that, and N equals 1, but I do strongly believe that there's something around the process that happened and the absence of that boys club to pull up the guy that allowed that many women into leadership positions in that company that is doing well under the females that have been leading that company as well.
Yeah, under the women, yeah. And again, that is a reality. So, I mean, we've talked about mentorship, and now we're talking about getting in the door. I mean, first we've talked about women do come in with the qualifications, which we know because they're dominating in university. Then we have to say, well, what keeps them out of getting into the positions that, for which they can be qualified? And that gets us to the entry, right? What happens at the door? What happens at the hiring process? And then we're getting to, well, why aren't they ascending to leadership if they have such competence? And so that gets us to the question of mentorship. All along, we have to consider the unequal burden of care and the invisibilized labor that they're performing, invisibilized, undervalued, uncounted, and so on, feminized, low status. And right throughout that process is the issue that you're raising, which is where are women at those different stages who are also supported and strengthened by a company policy or a company ethos that, in fact, this is something that it's important to us, that we don't see women fall off at lower levels or get stuck, that we see women climbing the ranks in an equitable manner.
Right.
So these are all, I think we've nailed, at various stages, these are all the core issues to consider.
I noticed that you use the word woman sometimes when I say female. So can you give me the context?
I was just being gentle, but but when there are some, because female becomes sort of an adjective, sometimes, so it can be I use it sometimes when I'm maybe describing data or something. But when we call women females, we're reducing them to their biology. So I tend to not talk about a female prime minister, but about a woman prime minister.
Right, okay.
Because when you talk about a woman, you talk about a whole person.
Gotcha.
As a social being, not just as a biological, not just somebody reduced to her biology.
Okay, I got it. Understood. I want to ask if you could speak to, and you do speak to them, but if you could speak to a woman who's more early in her career as to the advice that you might give to them as they frame their future in their careers, whatever those careers may be. I mean, what things might you want to share with that person?
So let's say they've just finished their degree and they're now out into the workforce. The first thing I would say is that every job that you get may not fit you perfectly, but out of every job, you're going to learn something. And that the first couple of years that you're really in the workforce are really about just getting an experience. Do you like being in a big company? Do you like being in a small setting? Do you want to deal with a lot of people, or do you prefer to kind of deal with paper quietly on your own at the back? It's really about discovering what's your workplace personality and best way of functioning. And it's okay in those first 2 or 3 years to just be you, to just experiment. There's nothing right. There's no wrong thing to do, because whatever you do, you could end up working in an ice cream shop, right? But out of that, you'll have a great experience of customer service and customer management that you can then put into something else. So that's first thing I'd say is don't stress about the first 2 or 3 years. Whatever you're doing is going to add up to something. The second thing, and that's important because a lot of young people don't get the jobs they want coming straight out, which can feel very stressful. But if you say to them, it's all fine, this is normal, then they're like, okay, maybe that ice cream shop job can in fact teach me something that I want. And that's okay. The other thing is that I got a lot of experience in my life, which may not suit a lot of people, but through things like volunteering. So I would always suggest that you volunteer at something, no matter what. You will meet super people volunteering who have all kinds of skills, all kinds of networks. You'll learn all kinds of things that you would not have otherwise. You'll also have things to put on your resume. Yeah. You'll have people who will write you reference letters. And so I spent a huge portion of my early years just super volunteering at everything. I would always suggest doing something like that because even though it's unwaged, and not everyone can afford to volunteer, but sometimes you can get a small stipend or something for travel costs. But if you can afford things like the travel costs to volunteer to wherever it is, I would say do it. It's going to strengthen any employer looking at what you're doing. It'll also give you super networks that'll help propel you into jobs. The third thing I would say is that you are going to feel really insecure or really uncertain or really hesitant. And you have to, even though you're afraid, you have to be brave. So it's okay to be afraid because it's new and everybody's older and they all look a bit scary. But fear can't stop you. So there's two kinds of people, the people who are afraid and back away and the people who are afraid and just try to be brave. Everybody's afraid at the beginning of new settings and new situations, especially if you're young. And anxiety is a major issue for a lot of young people today. So I think affirming that, while affirming you're going to have to push through, is important. And then once you get into a space, I would say find mentors. Just immediately reach out and say, listen, can I come and talk to you once a month? I'm not even sure about what, but you look like somebody who I could get good advice from. It could be a man, it could be a woman. I think it's great to start with women because it feels a little bit safer than trying to build an individual relationship with an older man. Rates of sexual harassment in our society in workplaces are off the scale. Young lawyers will tell you that older lawyers, there's huge amounts of sexual harassment in the field. It's highly complex, risky terrain, and that's the truth. So find a woman, but doesn't only have to be, but find a woman or a man who, and grab a mentor from the get-go. Because that person is somebody who you're going to go to and say, listen, I feel like I'm stuck here, or I feel like I'd like to do another task than the one I'm doing, or I feel like I'm doing lots of little itty bitty pointless things, but I'd like to do something in which I'm given leadership, and that'll allow me some autonomy and to show what I could do. I mean, young students have come to me and said, I'm doing lots of things, but I don't feel like I'm doing anything. And I said, okay, I'm going to give you one thing. You take role of that one thing. Thanks for coming and telling me that. Everybody's now exercising a leadership role in the thing that they're doing. So you got to come find a mentor and have those conversations. And then the last thing I would say is, focus on where you want to go. You may end up a completely different place. But if you're planning to go somewhere, then you're going to move and make decisions that'll help you get further than where you're going to go. Wherever you end up is a different story, but you need a plan, even if the plan changes every day. And even if the plan is not working out, when you lie down in bed at night, think, what's my plan? Where do I want to be in a month? Where do I want to be in 6 months? Where do I want to be in a year? Where do I want to be in 10 years? That plan can change minute by minute, but always move in your day as if you have a plan. And I'd just say, starting off there, that those alone would be what I would say to a young person coming out. It's tough out there. There are not a lot of jobs. The economies are shrinking. There's a huge amount of scholarship on what's being called expendable labor, which is being exacerbated by tech and AI. But if there will always be space for people who, for young people or young employees, or for somebody who looks like they have a spark and a drive. Having a spark and some desire to get somewhere in life, people will see that no matter where you are. And so you will always go somewhere.
I totally endorse the volunteering, and as it relates to the spark, I encourage people to look for volunteering opportunities in the areas in which they may have an inclination or passion towards. That really allows them to shine in that, which can further their career. Last question that I have is that let's role play a little bit and put myself in the position of a man in an organization. And I've listened to this podcast and I've realized, wow, there are no women on my leadership team, and I don't seem to see women progressing in my organization. They're stuck at reception, and wow, I need to maybe look inwards and see what's going on. How do I tackle this? What are the first 2 questions or 3 questions I need to ask, or what do I do in that circumstance?
Yeah, if a man has made it through this podcast, bless him, and you've done well. I would say, first of all, it's not quite as complex. It's not quite as simple as that. Very often, it's not just that women are all at the bottom. It's that you can say, but look, there's 2 women at the top and there's 3 women in middle management. So what's the problem? But it's not 50%, and they're not growing at the same rates, and their care responsibilities are not acknowledged necessarily. So it is often a little bit more thorny than a simple, I can see the oppression. And the first thing I'd say is, when it is not so obvious that inequity is taking place, assume that it is, because the world is structured ideologically. We've talked about the care economy, and there are all kinds of other factors. It is structured for women to not get to the top, right? So assume that it's happening, not that it's not a reality. So, and then I would start, if I was a man or indeed a woman, and there's tons of progressive men out there who are invested in justice and social change, I would start with having the conversation with the women in the office. Frankly, if you want change, you need to talk to the people who are experiencing the structural conditions as the most exclusionary, or as in ways that affect them most, and say to them, listen, there's 10 of you here, and I don't want to see you all stuck in low-level positions. So what's your idea of how this company can do it? I am a strong believer in consulting people around the table and listening to what people, I think there's always a ton of suggestions. Anytime you ask people for recommendations, they always have suggestions. And some of them are just about, why don't we have a retreat every year where we could look back at what worked and didn't work? They're not even big suggestions. They're not even expensive suggestions. But I think sitting with the people and saying, what's the change you would want to see? What are recommendations you have? And where would you like me to start? I think that's always key. Sometimes when we talk to each other, we discover the solutions more than when we try to come in and save situations
that you may know,
on our own.
So ask the questions in an authentic way and be willing to listen. You mentioned listening there. That's an important point. And I suppose do something with the information that you get.
And set a target.
Set targets.
Every company knows about SMART. SMART goals, SMART targets. If you don't have a target, then you're not really implementing seriously. Right. So you need to have a target that the company is setting, and then exemplify it and advertise it and amplify it and say, look what we did. We set it up, and now look what we've achieved. And so become a exemplar in that way. I think other companies notice that, and I think the world notices that more today.
I just want to thank you so much for your time here. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. I learned a lot. I learned a lot myself, and I hope all of our audience and listeners would have done so too. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us? Anything you wanted to add? Something we didn't cover you would have liked to talk about?
No, I think it's great. And I think we do live in a Caribbean where both women and men are invested in creating a better region, and one that's more equitable, one that's more safe, and one in which both women and men, and also, non-binary persons and others, which we didn't discuss today, but in which people, regardless who they are, can do well. And so I'm looking forward to that world happening and becoming our future.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, listeners, for joining us on another episode of the Roots of Equity podcast as we journey through the landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Caribbean. By embracing our differences, celebrating our shared heritage, and advocating for a more inclusive Caribbean, we can shape a brighter future for all. We hope that these conversations spark new insights, challenge existing perspectives, and inspire action to dig deep into the roots of equity. Once again, this is your host, James Walker. This episode was produced by Earl Edmund, edited by Jason Charles, with all music by Luke Walker. Until next time.